Just in relation to the revelation, right? At that moment, you realise there's no separation, and guilt and fear automatically fall away.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have a revelation, be aware that you're not separate, but like the life review you mentioned earlier on, you still have to come back and undo the guilt and fear that you have pushed out onto the world? It's almost like a life review. Can you go back in revelation and then still be caught up with certain amounts of guilt and fear?
Of course you can. You see, because every day since that, I've been making a choice. And I'm still in free will. So I can choose, not to do what I'm doing. I could have chosen many paths. I wasn't doing A Course in Miracles when I experienced revelation. What happened to me happened in 3 stages. The first stage was a week before my spiritual awakening. I surrendered the self. I looked at everything and I just basically surrendered it. I let it go. I don't know how I did it, but I did do it because I was in so much pain. The effect of that was that I had a spiritual awakening. I had an experience of my true self. The effect of that then, 4 months later, I had a higher self awakening. And within a week then, I was given the course. And someone gave me this book, Diane handed me this book as a present, and she says, make sense of that. And I opened it and started reading it, and that's when I was guided then to basically do the course and to be a teacher of the course. So I started hearing the voice within. I started hearing the voice of Jesus. So let's just, while we're doing this now, let's move to the 2 voices. Okay? What Jesus says in the course, right? You're listening to 2 voices. You have 2 masters. Okay? Now, to give you an idea what this means is I've been working with this girl, right? And she basically been doing the course a long time. She's doing the course over 20 years. But what she has done, she has intellectualized the course. She knows everything in the course, but she's not actually doing anything. All right? So what she's doing is she's actually reading it and understanding it and reading it and understanding it and theorizing it and doing all these things, but she's not applying it. So she contacted me a couple of weeks ago and we've been doing some work, and the first thing that I felt that she had to start going inside. So she started the meditation on Thursday, okay, and she did the meditation, and then I was speaking to her yesterday, right, and she says, this is not the way to waking up, So we were having the talk, and she had this voice, and I says, you had this thought that this is not the way to waking up. And I says, who had that thought? Oh, she said, that was me. I went, really? Okay. Who's you? She says, me. I says, hold on a minute. I says, sure, the real you doesn't think. So there's only 2 thought systems. Jesus says in the Course that the problem is not what you think. The problem is that you think. So therefore, there's 2 thought systems, and you're listening to either one or the other. All right? So the one place that the ego does not want you to go is where? Inside. So she was listening to the ego's voice, and she heard very clearly, right, that this is not for you. And she thought it was her. Okay? And the whole point about the Course and what Jesus is saying in the Course is, it's time to go inside. All right? Because we're so fascinated with outside. So what I wanted her to do was to start listening to the voice of the ego. Okay? We have to listen, and we have to understand and make a decision. Is this the ego, or is this spirit? Is this the Holy Spirit? Is this the voice for God? Because there's only 2 voices. And you're listening to one or the other all of the time. And Jesus says in the Course, he says, if you don't hear my voice, it's because you choose not to hear my voice. Why?
Yeah.
How do we not hear his voice?
Yeah.
No. Why? Anybody?
Cut off from this in some way.
Huh?
We're cut off from it.
Why? Yes, you're right. How? Because we're listening to another voice. We're listening to the ego. And as long as we stay listening to the ego, then we're not going to listen to Jesus. We can't hear both. It's either one or the other. So why are we listening to the ego? How does that trigger? What is the cause of that? What's the effects? How are we automatically tuning into the ego all the time? Anybody?
Is it stronger, louder?
Of course it is.
Well, it's
We're stepping
habit.
outside of it.
Huh?
It's habit.
Such as?
Well, what
One thing.
I can give you an experience. Is I go out walking with the dog. I live near a park. And when, in my old self, I'd just be, in there. But what I found is I'm having these big blocks of time where I'm not remembering. And I think I'm in those holy instants or a happy dream. And the ego's making me forget that I just had that.
Right. Where are you in nature?
Just out walking,
Yeah.
in a park.
In nature.
Yeah, but I'm having large gaps of forgotten time.
Yeah.
I've left the house. All of a sudden, I'm coming back to the house. This is where did the last hour and a half go?
Right. Okay. Right.
So
I'll show you exactly why that's happening. Anybody else? Anybody see? How do we just trigger? And we do it, but we don't know how we're doing this, and this is what this little video is about. Every single time that you seek for something outside yourself, you take yourself outside yourself, now you're listening to the ego. Now you're in the land of judgment. All nature is without judgment. And this is why people, they love going into nature, okay? Because everything around them is non-judgmental. You went back to the house, okay? Your home. And your home is where all your conditioning is. That's where all your seeking is. That's where your children are. That's where your loves are. That's where your hates are. These are all things that keep taking us outside of ourselves. You will never hear the voice of Jesus or God as when you're outside yourself. It's impossible. Because we're seeking for something from the ego. And as long as you're seeking for something from the ego, you step outside yourself, and now you hear only the ego's voice. The reason why I hear the voice of God or the voice of Jesus is because I stay in my center. I seek for nothing outside myself. And I'll share an experience with you that I had this week, was when I went to to do some shopping. Okay, I went to Aldi. And basically, I went around, had my bag, and I filled my bag full of all my groceries. And I was walking up to the counter, and this girl came over and she opened a new reel. Okay, so I was walking up. The reel was basically, the counter was empty, so I would have been the first there. And I noticed this girl coming over also with a shopping trolley, and the shopping trolley was full. So I went to stop because I noticed that she had a disability. She had only the use of one hand. Okay? So I went to pause, and the next thing I heard this voice saying, "Walk on." Right? And you might think that this would be the voice of the ego. And that's something the ego would say. Yeah, butter on here, So I walked on. Because I knew who the voice was, and I knew this was a lesson for me. So what I did was, I emptied out the bag, okay, the girl sat down and started to put the groceries through. I had the bag filled. And I noticed that the lady who had the disability was coming behind me, and she was taking out one at a time, okay? And by the time that I had paid for my groceries and everything, all right, she had just taken out the last part of her trolley. So the timing was perfect. So I asked Jesus, what was the lesson here? And the reason why I was going to pause and let her out was sympathy. I had sympathy for her because of her disability. And Jesus says, don't do that. Don't have sympathy for anybody. Because if I had waited and put her in front of me, she would have felt basically flustered, maybe confused, maybe, because she would have felt bad about holding everybody up because she was only able to take out one at a time.
Feel sympathy for somebody, they're going to start feeling sorry for themselves.
Exactly. So what Ken Wapnick used to always say is all you're doing is sticking the knife in deeper.
Reinforcing it.
Yeah, well, you're reinforcing the other person's suffering. So that's what false empathy was. So this lesson was really all about, for me, was that this was a lesson in true empathy, to treat this person the same way as I would treat anybody else. And that's what this lady wanted. If you ask anybody in disabilities, all they want is to be treated the same as everybody else. But my natural reaction was I was going to pause. Just because this girl had a disability, I was kind of feeling sorry for her. And I was corrected in that in an instant. And what I would, 2 years ago, I probably would have stopped and I would have questioned Jesus and I would have said, well, what's this all about like? Do you know? Because on my own story, I was a student of Ken Wapnick's, and Ken had been my mentor for the first 4 years. So 3 years ago, I had a very close relationship with Jesus throughout all of this. And basically I was guided to Ken by Jesus, because Ken was probably the greatest teacher of level 1 and level 2 of the course. And 3 years ago, then basically, up until that point, I would have been quoting Ken all the time, and I was doing all of Ken's teachings, and I was kind of, doing the foundations for my own teachings was all coming from Ken. So Jesus said to me, you have to drop Ken now. And that wasn't easy to do, because Ken had been a big part of my learning of the course. But I had to drop it, so I listened to Jesus and I dropped Ken. Then, 2 years ago, Jesus says to me, it's time to drop the book. So I had to drop the book. And I've only been listening to his voice for the last 2 years. No book. And some of you might have seen in the videos that I did last year where I was telling people, get your head out of the book. Start actually applying what the book says. Don't make the book a lifelong study of your head into this book, reading lesson after lesson, year after year. If you really want to hear the voice of Jesus, if you want to go to your internal teacher, it's time to drop all this theory and intellectualization of the course. It's time to go inside. It's time to do the meditations. It's time to seek for nothing outside yourself. Because as long as you're seeking for outside yourself, then you're always going to hear the voice of the ego. It makes sense. Because judgment is what the ego is. And it's a very loud voice. So seek for nothing outside yourself, and you will basically begin to hear the voice of Jesus, the voice for the Holy Spirit, or the voice for God, whichever that you want to put on. And remember, this is the two voices. You're either listening to one or the other, because you don't think, you have no thoughts of your own. You're either in one thought system or you're in the other thought system. You're either in the thought system of the ego or you're in the thought system of the Holy Spirit. That's the only two thought systems. That's the only two voices. Okay? Any questions on that? Happy? So is there anybody here listening to the voice of Jesus? Holy Spirit? God? Michael, you hear it?
Well, I have to admit, I don't know. Because I hear what you would think would be enlightened, and it doesn't turn out right. And then sometimes I follow what I thought was the ego, and it turns out to be enlightened. So I'm in that mixed up state still.
Because that's probably, because you're in this conflict, you're probably still seeking things outside yourself, and you're going inside. Because what we're doing is we've been so conditioned to always looking outside ourselves. We've always listened to the voice of the ego. So when people start doing forgiveness, when they start applying the course, they start to go more inside, then they get really confused. Because they start hearing two voices now and they're never sure. So you can always be sure of the one thing, that the voice for the Holy Spirit will always be in a state of being. Okay? The ego is always getting. It's always doing. It's always having. Whereas the voice for God is always getting you into that state of being rather than doing.
Yeah, I have the voice of God very consistently.
Very good. Very good. Okay, right.